Thank you. Call to order Board of Education special meeting, December 11th, 1 o'clock. Is Lisa on to take attendance?
I am on, and all board members are present, I believe, except for Mark. Although
Jennifer, I don't see Jennifer. Is she here?
I don't see, yeah, I don't see Jennifer, and actually I don't see Jackie either.
So Mark and Jackie are not able to be with us today.
Okay, thank you. Sometimes I think I just don't have the right screen, so I haven't seen them, but all right, so I think we're waiting for just Jennifer then.
So we have 4, so we have a quorum. Okay.
Yes. Yes, we have a quorum. Okay. With that, we will go to public comment. Do we have any public comment?
We do not.
We do not. Okay. With that, we will kick it over to our education portion of our workshop, High Impact Governing Education Workshop. So the purpose of this meeting is, as we're transitioning 3 board members off the board for their service and 3 board members coming on the board, we thought it would be good to look at our governance structure and take a look at, overall, how we could effectively work going forward as a team of 8, be strategic in our thinking, be strategic in how we're overall going to be looking at committees going forward. So we as a board, along with Pat and his team, have worked with Doug Eady, who's been doing this for years in terms of, he's written a book that we've all have read, about governance, about workshops, about committee structures. So, we're going to spend some time today working with Doug, and he's going to be working with us on a presentation on effective governance. With that, Pat, do you want to say a few words before we kick it over to Doug?
Yes, so definitely appreciate the opportunity for us all to come together and spend some time looking at a governance model. And would love to also get the opportunity to hear from Cynthia and Lisa, any thoughts that they might have as being part of the steering committee as we begin to move forward. So I'll turn it over to Cynthia or Lisa.
I just would say I have high hopes that today will help to have you have a stronger team moving into the year ahead and be pulling forward together and all the work that needs to be done to support a district.
And I'll echo that and just add how exciting it is to be part of change and looking forward and welcoming new board members, but also it's hard to say goodbye to the institutional knowledge of over 40 years of board service. So I hope that by working together, all of us as a team, and that we're committed to doing this even past January 1st, that we're able to create something that incorporates the past, present, and future of our district.
Thank you. With that, Doug, we'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you. I wish I could be with you in person, but alas, that's yet to come. Today, we are basically laying the foundation for a day-long true retreat, high impact governing work session is what we're calling it, early in 2021, probably divided into 2 segments. We haven't planned that out. But today we'll lay the foundation for that by taking a tour. And I'm really pleased to be your tour guide today through the very complex, rapidly shifting terrain of public nonprofit and specifically K12 governance. Now, in addition, and what I'm talking with you about is covered in some detail. It was a resource in the book I think you all have, and also presentations recently at both NSBA and AASA, their last actual in-person meetings. Now, I've also drawn on a resource I want you all to be aware of. It's a blog called board-savvysuperintendent.com. It has an advisory committee of some 30 educational leaders, including superintendents from all over the country. And I'm pleased that Pat has accepted our invitation to serve on the advisory committee. Now, I want you aware of the blog because we've got something like 100 articles and probably in the range of 40 or so video and audio podcast. And it's all free content. It's available to you. You can print it out if you want. For your own files or to share with other people. So it's a very robust reservoir of information focused heavily on the governance function and the role of the superintendent as the chief executive officer of the district. So let's begin by looking at this frontier territory, and indeed it is the frontier. Now, I want to point out before jumping in that every few slides, we're going to have a discussion slide with suggested questions. They are real life questions based on work with boards over 30 some years. They're not academic per se. We probably won't be able to discuss them all, but let me tell you this. Many of these questions will be discussed in real detail when we hold our high impact governing work session, our day-long session in 2021. So I want you to relax, enjoy. There'll be opportunity to ask questions and also to answer some questions if you're so inclined. But as I said, welcome to the frontier. We talk about a field called K12 governance, but there is no fully developed field called K12 governance. There is an emerging field. So what I want you to understand right now at this point in time, no one can point to a universally accepted set of core principles or practices we should all be following. It doesn't exist. There is a tremendous amount of debate around the country on principles and practices. An example would be committees. I'm a strong committee advocate. 35 some years of work with boards have taught me committees are a powerful vehicle for board productivity. But that's not science, and not everyone agrees with that. So you are in a rapidly evolving field, in a lot of flux, a lot of debate, and that's great, except you gotta be careful because there are a lot of what I call insidious foes of board effectiveness and of the board superintendent cabinet partnership you gotta watch out for. Because it's not a fully developed field, there are assumptions, and this is what an insidious foe looks like, very pleasant little critter. If you're an arachnophobe, you'll wanna avoid that foe. But here's what I mean by insidious foe. There are a lot of assumptions floating around that sound really plausible. And that's what makes them kind of insidious. I mean, many of them sound sensible. And you even find consultants and other people, gurus, usually self-styled gurus, preaching them. But they often aren't true. or at least not completely true. And we're going to talk about some more of them, but let me just tell you some of the things you want to watch out for. Here's an erroneous assumption. Districts doing well, doing more than well, doing tremendously well. We're performing at a high level. Well, that's true for Bloomfield Hills, obviously. Nationally, you loom very large. Superintendent's doing a great job, so we don't have to worry about the relationship. Well, you know better than that, I hope, and I learned very early in my career that doesn't matter how well things are going, relationships wear out. Boards and CEOs, including superintendents, with increasing frequency, part company. So if the relationship's taken for granted, no matter how well things are going, it might very well erode quickly. Another erroneous assumption I hear all the time is, okay, over here is policy making. That's the board's business. Over here is the administrative and executive function. That's why we have a superintendent. And the board should stay out of executive affairs. That's called the slap on the wrist approach to board development. And you got to preserve this firewall. Well, in reality, let me tell you what I learned. And most of what I'm sharing with you is just what I've learned traveling around the country for 30 years working with boards. Almost everything important in governance takes place around the table, often in committee meetings, with board members sitting with the superintendent and cabinet members. That almost all governance, all important decisions are collegial decisions made with all three parties. Sorry, there's no firewall. It's always crossed every day in every way. Now, you want to distinguish roles. You want the board to focus more on governing decisions and not on running the district. But as a matter of fact, you can't draw boundaries like that. There's also a wide movement around the country, not so wide, it was at one time, that if you really want to develop a board's effectiveness, just put a policy book together. It's called the policy governance approach. Some of you may have heard of it. Well, as a matter of fact, in real life, policies don't govern. Board members make decisions, and that's governing. And setting out the rules of the game, the rule book, doesn't play governing any more than it would play soccer or football or basketball or any other game. So rules only get you so far. They're useful. And finally, I hear this all the time. Oh, they won't be interested in developing their accountability as a board. They're not going to manage themselves. Well, as a matter of fact, the great majority of board members I've worked with around the country care very much about accountability and pay close attention to managing the board's performance. Now, you can probably think of many, many more insidious foes or erroneous assumptions you've come across. But here's what I want you to remember. Because it's a fluid field, very rapidly changing, you got to keep your eyes open. You got to be in law. If there are any attorneys, I don't remember. Oh, yes, there are attorneys right here, right in front of me is an attorney. Caveat emptor, buyer beware. Be careful what you believe. It's a good Latin phrase, those of you whose modern language is Latin like mine is. So what's going on? Well, let me tell you a few of the things I'm seeing, and maybe you're seeing them too. Number one, new breed of board member. I'm meeting them everywhere. They're less patient. They expect to make a difference pretty fast. They refuse to be an audience for finished documents, so they don't just sit and thumb through documents as staff have finished. They expect to play a really important role that makes a difference. And they do expect to hit the ground running, not sit around learning the ropes for meeting after meeting after meeting. So I'm meeting a pretty demanding group. I love it. Very demanding group of board members. I'm also seeing a growing understanding that using phrases like policymaking or saying a board's a policymaking body just causes confusion. Number one, it has no meaning. I would never call a board a policymaking body, ever. It doesn't have any meaning. Policies are rules. You need a few of them. And if you got them, great. Update them every so often. A board is basically a decision-making body. Concrete decisions, and we're going to talk about that. It's a judgment-making body. How well are things going? So don't think in static, old-fashioned terms of, we're a policy-making body. Yeah, you are maybe 10% of the time. But mainly we're making some very concrete decisions. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, because I really want you to get a grasp of the nuts and bolts of governing as it's developing around the country. I've already mentioned the collegial aspect, and it's sweeping the country now. We do know governing is a team sport, and we know everyone has to be at the table. It's not the board sitting up there on a dais and the staff down here making reports. It's people around the table. And here's a really interesting one that I'm seeing. The lecturing about micromanagement is finally beginning to wane, and that's great. The great majority of board members I meet have no desire to micromanage. And micromanaging, of course, is a term we use to describe a board heavily involved in administrative details. What I do find is this: if a board is not well developed, if it does not have a clear role and governing mission, if it does not have a modern structure, if it does not have very, very well-defined processes for engaging in things like strategic planning and budget development and performance monitoring, in those cases where the board is not terribly well developed, it's easy for micromanagement to happen by accident. And so I think we're beginning to realize the greatest barrier to micromanagement is, let's develop the board as a stronger governing body. And of course, that's what we're all about in this work we're doing together, is taking an already excellent board, seen as excellent all over the United States. I mentioned to a number of colleagues over the last few weeks that I'm working with you, and there's instant recognition. Oh my gosh, that must be exciting. This is obviously a great district and so on. So we are talking about taking an already good board and let's take it to the next level. So what do we know about high impact boards? Let me cover a couple of things. This relates somewhat to what I've said before, but let me sort of capsulize it right now. Here's what a high impact board, a really high impact board, looks like. Number one is working with a superintendent who's truly board savvy. That's so important that there's a column in AASA magazine. I have a new column I wrote for that column that just appeared in the December issue called The Board Savvy Superintendent. Second, they understand governing inside out. They're experts in governing. They know what it is, and they want to do it at a high level. Third, they rigorously manage their own performance. Self-evaluation is the hallmark, one of the hallmarks of a really high impact board that constantly monitors itself and hence gets better. They have standing committees. Not everyone agrees with that, but it's on my list. Not just committees, but well-designed committees. And then they consciously develop processes for engagement, consciously, that are written. Detailed process. Here's what we do in budgeting. Here's what we do in strategic planning, and so on. And they don't take the relationship with the superintendent for granted or any other chief executive. They manage it consciously. So who is this board savvy superintendent that I've been talking about? Let me paint just a little picture. And I'm seeing more and more and more board savvy chief executives in the public nonprofit sector. Many more than I saw 4 or 5 years ago. Well, here's how you know. And I think this is you'll be happy to know a pretty good description of Pat and what he's doing. Number one, they look at the board, what do they see? An asset. It's my job to help grow that asset called the board. It's my job to help it get better. And working with that board is one of my top priorities. I'm not worried in the least about protecting myself from the board, so they don't have a defensive bone in their body. Second, governing makes their top 3 or 4 functions. As chief executive of an educational enterprise, working with the board and working in the governance function makes their top list. And by the way, typically, you know them by the fact that they spend at least 25% to 30% of their quality time directly thinking about the board or working with the board. Third, they're experts in governing because they spend so much time in it. They do a lot of reading. They've got a library, and that's a sign that it's a high priority. And there are 3 hats they wear that we won't have a lot of time to talk about, but I want you aware of those hats. Board savvy superintendents take responsibility for helping their board get better. They don't sit back and say, you guys and gals ought to be developing your effectiveness, ought to develop your board so you're doing a better job, blah, blah, blah. No, they accept that with volunteers, you can't expect them. They have other lives to carry the full burden. So they are aggressive in helping the board get better. Number 2, they spend a lot of time thinking about process and recommending processes for board engagement. They don't take it for granted the board will take care of that itself. That is not realistic. And they do not accept that the board should be an audience for finished staff documents, whatever they are. And then third, they focus heavily on the human dimension of the relationship with the board so that they understand that relationships take a lot of nurturing, a lot of interaction, or they erode. So here are some questions. We'll stop now for any questions you might have. And also I want to share with you some questions. We don't have to answer them all today, but at least what I recommend you do is you go away this weekend, and in future weekends, you have some time. You got the questions. Think about them. They're questions that board members often think about and should be thinking about. Number 1, are you watching out for other erroneous assumptions we should protect ourselves from? I've mentioned a few. Can anyone offhand think of any that you've run into? Assumptions about governing that have been proved wrong or been proved dangerous?
Do you just want people to call out or indicate in
Yeah.
the chat room? Okay.
Oh, no,
Aaron?
we're not going to break into just, we'll never get through this if we try to be too elaborate
Well,
about it.
I have one, Doug.
Yes,
I think that if board members aren't given sufficient information about plans and processes, then the tendency is for board members to make assumptions that things are not happening that actually may be happening, or not happening in a fashion or an extent that is a really great way, and maybe it is, and we just don't know about it. So you can have this communication gulf that can, in both directions, that can cause assumptions to be formed, which are horrible.
right. And so I guess one could say you can't assume that communication is going to be full and adequate. It would be an erroneous and probably dangerous assumption. And you know what that tells you? And we're going to be talking about this especially in 2021. I can't wait to get to our full day together with breakout groups and everything else. Because one of the things we can do and even talk about later is what are guidelines for effective communication from the superintendent to the board and between the board and the superintendent. Yes, I saw a hand.
Yes, so something I have experienced as a candidate and as I watched 27 colleagues over the last 22 years be elected onto the Board of Education, the election process pushes candidates to be critical and makes it very difficult for them to come together as a team and become ambassadors for your school district as you move forward. And as the laws for school board elections have evolved in recent years, it has created a situation where our board is experiencing more board member turnover in a very short period of time than has ever happened in the past. And so I think that creates a challenge in and of itself for creating a team that is going to be able to work together. And that's not to be critical of anybody. This is what I've observed of everyone who's elected in my own experience. You are asked by every piece of media and organization, what will you want to change when you get into the district? And it can create a concern over trust. And it takes a while for a board member to learn about all the things that they were curious or concerned about coming in, and be able to address it and come together and understand why things are the way they are. There may be changes that need to be made, or that you see new ways of being able to address, but that takes time to communicate effectively and find its place in the agenda for the board to move forward. And that can cause frustration sometimes for newly elected board members, because all of the changes that they would like to see don't make it onto the agenda as soon as they would like to see. And so it makes moving forward as a team harder. And I've seen in recent years the role of partisan politics spread more into our conversations, that I think is good, because all of us, one of our roles is to work with our legislator partners, both in Lansing and in Washington, D.C., and we have to work with our electeds no matter which party they are with. And in Michigan, that continues to go back and forth. So I've always really believed that public education, taking care of our children, is a nonpartisan endeavor. Public and private school kids, they're all children, and they all need to be well educated. They all need great teachers. And they all, our teachers, wherever they may be, need to be well supported. And those are concerns that I had.
Thank you. Now, I will tell you, I concur strongly that board team building is a serious issue. I'm seeing that around the country. There are many challenges to that, the way we elect school boards, very different from the, let's say, a hospital board or a college board that is filling its own vacancies. It's relatively easy to build a team if you're the Cleveland Clinic board and you're filling or the Mayo Clinic and you're filling your seats. So it's a big issue. And what we're learning is that team building is not a matter of training. You can't train teams. It's much more complex than that. It's not a touchy-feely, quick, let's be nice to each other sort of thing. It's not a therapeutic kind of process. It's a pretty hard-nosed process, and we'll be talking about it, especially in 2021. How do we turn our board into a true governing team? Doesn't mean you agree with each other on everything. And there are ways we can do that. We're not going to cover them right now, but thank you. Any other comments about these assumptions we make?
Yeah, Doug?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Howard.
Hi, Howard.
Hi. Related to the superintendent in terms of being board savvy, two things, and they're kind of offsetting each other. One is, and you kind of what you were talking about with Cynthia just now, what is the role, if any, of the superintendent in terms of recruiting board members for the election, number one? And then number two, where you talk about that the chief executive should devote between 25 and 30% of their time, which is wonderful, but they also have a district to run. How do you see the superintendent freeing up the time to be able to dedicate, a quarter to a third of their time to working with the board?
Well, I see them doing it. I would say the great majority of the CEOs I work with, including superintendents, spend roughly, and especially the ones that are really effective, roughly 25 to 30%. And they do it by hiring top people to handle administrative functions. By nature, the chief executive is not an administrator per se, but the one running the whole shop. So I know it's possible. I'm not saying it's easy. It takes a lot of discipline and focus, and it takes a lot of good hiring. It's interesting. You ask about recruiting. You could not, Howard, you could not have picked a more controversial question to ask than the role of the superintendent in recruiting board members to run. I would say that would be a dangerous role. The great majority of superintendents I've worked with wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. They'd be very, very careful. So I'm not sure you want superintendents engaged in recruitment of candidates for the board. That's just my opinion. And I'm not.
You talk about, you talk about the Mayo Clinic or other type of nonprofits, which are appointed boards, and I think the CEO is, very much involved.
Oh, and the CEO may be the leading person, and very likely will be. I know for a fact from my 25 years in Cleveland that the CEO of the Cleveland Clinic plays the leading role in identifying potential board members.
So how is that different than in a school board?
The politics, Howard. The fact that politics in the K12 sector can be pretty brutal. It can be dangerous territory.
Okay.
And a superintendent would have to be very careful not to be identified with particular board members. I would consider it maybe career threatening, actually. which it would never be. I was looking over a book by the immediate past CEO of Disney. Has a wonderful discussion about his years at Disney and how much time he spent recruiting top board members as a key part of developing that company. COVID, of course, has hit the bottom line tremendously, but he's an acknowledged great CEO.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you. Now, here's another question.
I'm sorry, real quick, because just to follow up to Howard's question. I didn't interpret, maybe you meant this differently, but when you said 25% approximately of a superintendent's time, I think that it's not mutually exclusive of other things that the superintendent's doing. I'm thinking just immediately of getting to know Pat and his leadership style. And for me, it comes as much from, more so even seeing him interact with other people. So it might be a 2-second dialogue after, getting his impressions following a meeting that we both attend. While he's doing his job, he's also cultivating relationships simultaneously by allowing us to be part of it and to observe and participate in the way that he does his job.
And that's an excellent observation. I would call that part of the 25 to 30%. It would be, but he's then thinking about board member engagement, thinking about the role of the board in the external arena. I'm talking about much more. So I'm agreeing with you, much more than just preparing for board meetings and preparing for committee meetings, but thinking about the board and helping board members become more effective. Now, another question that you might want to think about is to enrich your board experience, your governing experience, is what return on the investment beyond the obvious return are you looking for from your governing experience? Now, the obvious outcome is the basic product of the educational enterprise, which is the achievement of our students. We prepare our students for full and fulfilling lives. Obviously, we want students well prepared for the modern world, prepared to thrive. But beyond that, is there anything you can ask as a board member for all this time you're putting in? And the more you think about that, the more rewarding your governing experience is. For example, developing certain leadership skills is something many board members have told me in interviews they want to get from their time on the board. You learn from other trustees about leading. You become a more influential person because you're on a really top board, and you learn by observing. People have said to me they want to learn more about public speaking, believe it or not. I do a lot of interviewing of board members. And one of the things many board members have said over the years, I hope to sharpen my platform skills from my work on the board. Some people speak all the time. Attorneys, for example, tend to have lives filled with a lot of speaking. Well, it kind of depends on the part of law, but they're more than average performing. But there are many people who don't spend that much time on a platform. And so I encourage you to think about the outcome of all of this time and effort you're putting in. Granted, at the top of your list will be what happens to our students, and our product is educating them. Another question you have to think about all the time is this: it is your board. It will be as good as you want it to be, and you help it become. Period. The governing experience will be as rich as you design it to be. The law does not constrain you gives you some guidelines. There's some things you got to steer clear of, like conflicts of interest and so on. But as a matter of fact, the board is an organization by definition. Any organization can be developed systematically to become more effective at doing what it does. Your product is governance. So we want consciously to be asking ourselves, and it's a question I ask in interviews, where are you strongest as a board? Where are you less strong? What are your greatest strengths? What are your weaknesses? And by the way, in 2021, when we do that full day session, we've already designed into that a pretty searching look at that question, because that's the only way you know where you want to get better. Anyone want to chime in? I know that's you may be a little reluctant to do some sort of assessment of strengths and weaknesses, but anyone see a really great strength of this board? Yes.
Well, Doug, this is Howard again. I wanted to go back to number 2 in terms of the investment, return on investment.
Yes, sir.
And I'm speaking purely for myself now. And again, we've got 7, really 10 people on our board, because we've got 3 people that are leaving and 3 people coming in. But from my standpoint, I'm not personally looking for a benefit to me, myself, in terms of my personal enrichment. But I do see, and you talk about, not being merely an audience for finished staff work. I mean, our board is made up of very, very accomplished people with PhDs, people who are lawyers, people who have advanced in the business world. And to be sitting there and just having finished work presented to you and voting on that material and moving on, I think is a waste of a incredibly valuable resource.
I agree 100%. And one of your expectations is, of course, you will not spend time thumbing through, or a lot of time thumbing through finished documents.
And then adding on top of that, exactly, if you're just sitting there and getting sit and get material, what motivation is that for a person to run again for the board, or to run in the first place for a board, if they're just sitting there and listening and raising their hand?
Well, you're right. You're right. And it's one of our challenges. And by the way, we're going to get into this as we go through this today. And remember, we're looking at the whole terrain today, so we can only dig so deeply. But one of the things we do want to look at is this question of engagement. I want to describe to you a way of thinking about it and a way of getting command of it. But never forget, the board will be as effective and fulfilling for you as you want. It's in your hands. And you want your CEO to play an important part in helping you get there as a board. That's where the 25 to 30% comes in.
Now, going back to what you were talking about with Jennifer, you said it's in our hands. And one of the issues, though, is we do not have the data in our hands. The data, all the information about the district, all resides with the organization, not with the board.
Well, that's something you can work on. We obviously can't today in great detail, but I'll show you where that would fit.
Okay.
In a committee structure. I'm working with a performance monitoring committee around the country that is dealing with that very issue. And remember this too, with Pat's collaboration and support, it is within your purview to determine what you should be seeing as a board. Let me say that very candidly. No one can tell you what you must see. You want to develop a flow of information, working closely with Pat and his team to this board to make sure you're getting what you think you need to do your job. Well, with your permission, Howard, I want to come back to that a little bit. little bit later. And now let's get to what might seem like a needless topic, and that's what do we do when we govern? And sometimes people say to me, oh, that's very obvious, you know, we're policymakers and whatnot. But actually, what I've learned is it's not all that obvious, and it's definitely not easy to do. And I got to share something with you. I may have shared this with some of you before. I think among the most difficult governing jobs in these United States, the very top of the list is K12 education. I think school boards have probably the greatest challenge of any boards I'm working with. Not because they don't have good people, they do have good people, but because of the pressures, both political and otherwise, on school boards. We expect public schools to do a tremendous number of things for our communities beyond strictly educating students. Even that's hard enough. So governing is hugely difficult. It's one reason I'm in Florida now after 30 years in Chicago and Cleveland, but in Florida, school board members are paid around $50,000 a year. Now, granted, that's not going to build you a summer home or anything, but it is a nice little chunk of change because it's recognized how difficult the job of governing is.
They're paid how much?
Around $50,000 a year, depending on the district.
I'm moving to Ohio.
No, I didn't say Ohio.
Oh, I thought you
Florida.
said
Florida. No, I promise you it's not true. It's not. And one of the reasons, of course, is the size of Florida districts being countywide districts.
Yeah.
And it's a huge job. Well, now let's dive in here. Jamie, my assistant, you might have seen her picture. You won't see her living, breathing picture, but you'll see a picture of her, is going to remind me at 2:30 it's time for a break. So I want to make sure we arrive at 2:30 doing what we say we're going to do. But let's answer this question. What does a board do when it governs? And you know, I want to tell you, when I moved from Dallas to Tampa Bay about 20 years ago, I was working on a book for Aspen called Extraordinary Board Leadership. And I had, because I'm not fond of research, particularly academic research, I don't have a great interest in, I'm not a professor. So I got a graduate student at the University of Oregon, Matilda Dees, to do some research for me on current thinking about governing and the role of boards and so on. Just sort of put together a good reading list so I could catch myself up beyond what I was learning from my work. She called me in about 3 weeks and she said, Doug, you won't believe this. I'm not getting any definition. I'm reading. I still can't say I know exactly what a school board does. Get a lot of preaching about what it shouldn't do, like don't micromanage and stuff like that, but I'm not learning much about what the concrete work is. And that was great for me because it got me thinking about what do boards do. So I want to suggest to you what I see boards doing and get your opinion on that. But this is important because it is a key to developing the board into a more powerful governing body, making the good even better. And the only way you can do that is if you've got a pretty clear agreement on what the work is we're trying to make better. So I concluded, I went through hundreds of client files and notes, and I concluded that at the highest possible level, what a board does is answer questions. And the best boards tend to have highly curious people. who do want to know a lot. And they ask questions, very high level. And they do it not alone, of course, but with their partners in governing, the superintendent and the cabinet members, as we call them. Now, one question is what you might call the strategic question, the gold standard for a board. Where are we taking this district over the longer run? Now, a lot of people can help you answer that question as a board, but I think it's now widely recognized that is the gold standard question for governing, is where are we taking this precious enterprise? What do we want it to look like in terms of the educational programs we have? For example, you're facing a big strategic question. We've done a lot of virtual education, haven't we, lately? There's going to be a new normal, but what's it going to be when we get rid of this terrible health crisis? What is the mix going to be of virtual education and in-person education? Will it be the same? Do we just return? Or have we learned anything? Those are board questions. That it's just an example. That's a very strategic question. And that raises other questions. Does that mean we should make a bigger investment over the long run in virtual education? And so on and so forth. So we have, for each of these questions, processes that are used by the board to answer the question. And structure. A process would be strategic planning. If you've got a modern, well-designed strategic planning process, then you can engage the board in that process to answer long-range questions about the district. Number two, who are we right now and next year? Well, that has a lot to do with mission. It has a lot to do with our current educational programs and facilities. It has a lot to do with, of course, the big B, budget. Of all things, budget's probably your best description of who you are at any point in time. Because if you're not spending money on it, you're not doing it. So you get a very, you seriously are not doing it. So budget is a stellar answer to the question, who are we now and next year? So we need to hitch the board to a budget process that engages it in shaping the budget. In fact, I was doing a coaching session with the superintendent. I do a lot of one-on-one coaching, which I love as part of my work. And one of the questions he asked me was, how can I get the board engaged in a more creative way in budgeting? Because I'm taking all this flack because all they get is a finished budget and they thumb through it and they don't feel like they're really having much impact on what it looks like. And it's a very valid question that we face. And then, of course, and Howard has reminded us of this, and he did just a couple minutes ago. The board asks the question, how are we doing? And how do we know how we're doing? Do we get the information we need to know how we're doing? Is it reliable? Can we make judgments? So governing involves answering the question, here's how well we're doing educationally, which is our basic, of course, mission. But we have to know how we're doing financially. Problems looming ahead of any kind that we need to worry about? Expenditure revenue lines, where we want them to be. And then even managerially, and you could say, well, wait, that's not the board's business. You better believe it's the board's business at a high level. What's your turnover? Do you pay competitive salaries? Do you attract top talent? You choose the superintendent, which is one of the preeminent decisions of every board, and hence you're dealing with the top level managerial question when you choose a superintendent. So at the highest level, here's what I want you to remember. You're a question answering machine. If you don't like the word machine, let's take something less mechanical. You're a question answering organization. And you have to be hitched to processes to answer the questions, like a budget process, like a strategic planning process. Now, let's move down another level. Let's dig in a bit. What is the nuts and bolts work of governing? Well, here's what I'm saying, and I think now this is getting widely recognized. When you govern, and let's strip away all the fancy stuff, okay? Forget the paper, forget the flow of paper, because part of your challenge to be a ever more powerful board is to get above the paper, not be governed by paper that flows to you, but get above the paper. Governing is making decisions and judgments based on concrete documentation. Decisions and judgments about very concrete things. I call them governing products, and they tend to flow along certain broad lines. Think Mississippi, Columbia, Potomac, broad, Hudson, broad lines. Strategic and operational planning and budget development is a stream of decision making. It's gold. It's a stream you want to pay a lot of attention to. Performance monitoring, the public expects it. It's the accountability stream. And the board should be making judgments frequently about how well things are going. And then we've got a role too in external stakeholder relations, but I want to tell you, my judgment is that's an important role based on my experience, but not everyone agrees with me. I want to be honest. I happen to think boards are powerful builders of stakeholder and community relations, and board members should be actively engaged. But once again, that's for you to decide. So think of governing as making decisions and judgments that flow along these lines based on good information you're getting. And let me give you an example of what it might look like. Let's say you have a planning committee of the board. Planning is, once again, a powerful, powerful process in governing, almost second to none, to tell you the truth. And so you have a planning committee. That planning committee is going to be thinking about products like this in strategy. These aren't the only ones, by the way, but there are some critical strategic products. Literally, listen, friends, when the chairperson of the planning committee brings to the board an updated value statement for the district and asks the board to vote on it, the board is making one of the preeminent governing decisions a strong board makes. Doesn't mean you don't get input. You can get as much input as you want. The committee can get input from the community. The planning committee can get input from faculty and buildings, all kinds of ways of getting input. But the point is, at some point, something gets acted on. The same thing is true of a vision statement. So a value statement, a vision statement, A new mission statement for the district. Every so often, you don't want mission to hang around for years and years because communities change, cultures change. And so how you describe what you do should change. Now, here's another example. Goals, issues, change initiatives. All of those can be concrete products of governance. I'm working with boards. One of my specialty areas is change management. I've done a couple books in that area. And in the world we live in, believe me, you may not love change. God knows I don't. But change is tough. But you better be a change aficionado in this world, let me tell you. And so we do look to boards to say, not only what are our long-term goals and how do we describe those long-term goals, but what are the big issues we're facing, both opportunities and challenges, and what kinds of initiatives should we fund to deal with those issues. That's real governing. Those are concrete products. And then, of course, that tried and true, very powerful product of a board, the annual budget. I'm a former state and big city budget director from many years ago. It's not my love anymore. But one thing I learned being budget director in Ohio and of Portland, Oregon, is budget is a powerful tool for a board. So when the planning committee of the board, and budget by definition is a planning function. When the planning committee of the board brings the budget document to the board to adopt, you are making one of the preeminent governing decisions. So the challenge is to figure out how do we engage the board before that document, that product is finished. And that's where a good committee and process come in.
Doug, before
yes.
you go on, can you go back one slide? How do you define an operating plan?
Well, as you know, there's no one definition, and you'll define what you want it to be. The way I define it is it's a set of specific goals, and it could be at any level you choose, of course, depending on the organization. It can be at a building level. It might just be district-wide, but an operating plan is basically goals and schedule for achieving them. It's almost by definition annual, and the budget just adds the financial dimension to it. Here's what we're going to be spend to achieve it.
Got it.
If there are not any measurable goals, budget loses meaning. And that's where many boards I've worked with over the years have gotten terribly frustrated because they can't see that there's any influence they can have over budget. After all, most of the costs are fixed, right? In terms of cost, this year's budget is basically next year's budget tweaked, unless you've got a massive infusion of resources.
Doug, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
In your committee structure, your proposed committee structure, how our current board process on budget usually has our administration pulling together the entire board 2 or 3 times before we are to vote on the budget before the end of June.
Good.
Are you suggesting that that should only be happening within the committee? In my opinion, it's really important for the whole board to be learning, particularly with this board that hasn't had a lot of experience with this for very long.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying your participation will be tend to be, this is only my experience, but there's a fair amount of it, will tend to be more effective if you've got a committee responsible for overseeing that function. So for example, many planning committees host the full board work sessions and do the planning to make sure the agenda is well done and so on. Work closely with the superintendent preparing for those sessions. So it's more the concept of a committee responsible for overseeing the board's engagement, not for doing all the engagement. And it works. It gets better, period, by having a responsible committee. So I'm working with the board right now where the planning committee of the board will host 2 work sessions. They're very meticulously prepared. One of them will be a Saturday, better part of a day session, looking at operational issues and areas we need to tweak to give the board a chance for input before the dollars get firmed up. It's going to be very exciting. And the planning committee is working closely with the superintendent.
One of the things, Cynthia, the difference I think what Doug is describing and what we do, all of the detail is really maintained by the operational group, the administration, and all we really look at the board level is the totals. And not all boards do it that way. And that's something I think we're going to be looking at going into the future.
You have to, it is your board. Let me remind you once again. And traditional practices cannot be the guide to the future. It's always important to open it up. And the best way, and this is not chaotic, is to have a committee responsible. And then it's a fairly orderly process. In fact, right now, every board I'm working with, and in recent years, the planning committee of the board actually works with the chief executive, often a superintendent, to update the planning process that will be followed, tweak it. So they sit together in a committee meeting. They say, you know, we had two work sessions last year with the whole board. Maybe we need 3. One session we had didn't appear to go terribly well. Why? Why wasn't it powerful? We thought it would be exciting. Friends, that's your business. That's the committee's business. So it's a way, an orderly way of planning board engagement, if you will. I'm going to come to that again with your permission when we come to committees.
Thank you, Doug. I didn't mean to take you off track here.
You didn't take me off track. It was a great observation. Now, remember, you're also playing a monitoring role. The public cares a lot, obviously, that you're monitoring performance. And so we want, typically, and you'll decide the way you're going to go, but this is a way that it's happening commonly, is that you use a performance monitoring committee or something similarly named of the board, and you collaborate with the superintendent or CEO, depending on the organization, to talk about what reports we're now getting. How effective are they? Are there new reports we should be getting? What would the content be? Can we improve the format of the reports? From my work in finance earlier in my career, not in recent years, but earlier in my career, I was stunned by how bad much of the financial reporting was that organizations got, board members got. Very hard to understand often, rows and columns of numbers, not a creative use of graphics, and so on. Now, I'm not an expert on how you do things, nor am I critiquing you. But I do know that reporting can always get better. We can always tweak it. We can always come up with new things we should be hearing about. We can always come up with ways of using graphs and charts and PowerPoint to make reporting more dynamic. And then we've got the job of actually doing the assessments. Well, the weakest way of assessing is to send a full board a packet of reports, and they're discussed at a board meeting. It is not possible to carry out the monitoring job thoroughly that way. So many boards have a committee that takes the first look at performance reports and then briefs the board, and the board has access to all the reports typically that the committee has looked at, so there's full transparency, but the committee's taken the job of doing the first cut analysis and identified some issues. Most of the time there aren't any issues, but if we see one developing, then we want to be alerted to it. And this is, yes.
Doug, so if you can give some examples of, when you say educational, financial, administrative reports, what is, in your experience, been like operational reports and much more, and then in your experience, what have been more strategic reports that boards have gotten?
Well, strategy's a total different area. I don't distinguish between strategic reports and operational reports all that clearly. This is my take on it. It's a very dynamic thing. If you have a traditional strategic plan, which I hope you don't, a traditional strategic plan, and the field's changing, it's in the middle of a revolution. But there's less and less attention being paid to traditional long-range planning for good reason. In a rapidly changing world, plans can be outdated fairly quickly. But the classic notion is that every year you're looking at, when you look at your performance report, you're looking at what you're achieving within the framework of that long-range plan. And so it kind of loses, it's basically annual reporting broken down into months. And that works very well for monitoring ongoing operations. What's happening, and this is why I think you're going to want a planning committee. By the way, it's not the Doug Eady model. I do want you to know that. I'm learning a lot from looking at different boards and working with boards. I did not invent this model of board structure. I don't care a lot about semantics, what you call a committee, but I do think that this is a sensible division. Here's what I'm seeing develop, and I think you might want to try it. The best comprehensive plan you've got is the annual operating plan and budget. Okay, there's no other plan, because the world's changing fairly quickly. You wouldn't want to project very, very far ahead. That's a waste of time and money, frankly, and paper in a rapidly changing world. So you've got one comprehensive plan that you can really rely on. It's about a year to 2 years. Some organizations do biennial budgets. Many states do. I was budget director in a state that had a biennial budget as opposed to an annual budget. But much beyond that, things change so rapidly. Those plans sit on the shelf for that reason. What's happening now is what many organizations are doing is they're saying, okay, here's our annual operating plan and budget. Now, do we see any big issues looking ahead where we need to invest beyond the boundaries of that budget in some kind of change? Something that's not in the budget. So it becomes a more selective process as opposed to saying, take everything you're doing and project it 5 years in the future, which I submit to you is total waste of time. Total. There's only one area that's a reliable multi-year planning process, and that's capital improvements. And each capital budget will have different time frames, of course, because your projects aren't all completed at the same time. But that's the one area where formal long-range planning works very well, is capital investment, building a new building. Now,
Doug, before you go on that right hexagon, where I know what educational and financial are, and I'm kind of into definitions right now. What are you calling, what's an administrative performance report?
okay. Now, once again, it's if you want it. I'm giving you an example of something you might want.
Okay.
I'm not saying, Howard, you need or want it. But
I don't know what you mean.
Okay, many of my clients, for example, do choose to monitor things like how competitive are we in attracting talent.
Okay.
That's administrative performance. How up to date are we in using technology in management? I can't say I know because I don't know you that well. I've just begun working with you. And then, of course, we became totally virtual. But you might want to know whether we are making the best use of technology. You might want a committee actually thinking about that. So things like that. Are we competitive? What is turnover in the district? I submit that's a board's business because it actually has huge impact on quality.
So something like diversity in the workforce.
Absolutely diversity.
Okay.
But here's the thing I want you to remember. It's at its best. No one can train you in this area. By the way, you're beyond training. I've never worked with a board that could really be, you're so far beyond training, nor do you need it. You can't train a board into knowing what you should be asking for and what you should be looking at. You must decide yourself with Pat's help and the help and collaboration of your senior administrators.
Got it.
All together, preferably in a committee setting, ask yourselves, do we need to be tracking different things? We've got financial reporting down pretty well. Typically, we could tweak it. We have ways of monitoring educational performance. They're not perfect. Of course, we have standardized testing that has emerged in recent years. But administrative performance, very often, we're not tracking it at all, and yet it has huge impact. So you agree with Pat. Now, by the way, this is where operating policies might come in. Policies to govern how you run the district. And to the extent the board should look at any, it's handy to run them through a committee like this. Because there are some policies you really do want at a high level to see. Human resource management policies at a high level, maybe not all the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts stuff, but at a high level are very important to a board.
So that reporting should really be linked with the goals that are set, and then you use the reporting for the accountability on how we're doing against the goals.
That's right. Ideally, that's what you would do. Now, let's look at one other area. I'm watching my time. I'm going to run over, but isn't this fun stuff, though? You know, I hope you're getting a picture of how much latitude there is for turning this board with Pat's help into your board. I don't want you to feel that you're there and that somehow there are all these procedures you've got to learn. You will, to a great extent, develop structure and processes over time of your own as a board, and you will institutionalize them. And people like me, but there are a lot of people like me, can advise in that process. Now, another area, but a little more controversial, And very often, by the way, you can't afford to have a committee in this area because the board might not be large enough, or maybe you don't think it's an important topic for you. But many boards I'm working with are paying close attention to image in the community, to relationships with key stakeholders, and board members are getting engaged in speaking on behalf of the district, which I strongly subscribe to. There's no equal, by the way, to board members representing the
Doug,
district.
I have a question. I'm sorry.
No,
But
don't be sorry.
We've had, I didn't mean to cut you off in the middle, but we have had some questions about board members speaking, for example, which goes to a larger issue. As a board of 7, we don't always agree on whether we've gotten adequate information. Some people think we have more than enough information that we need to be able to evaluate and to hold people or processes accountable. Others think that we don't. So I wonder, I'm sure you're going to be addressing this because I've seen.
If not now, at least next year.
But yeah, I don't want to leave even today because I don't know how much time, and we do have new board members coming on, and some of us are fairly new ourselves, with the impression that anybody ever acts unilaterally. No matter what we think individually, it's always going to have to be a decision of 7. So there's one board member has 0 ability to speak to the public, for example, or to speak to external stakeholders. That has to be a board of 7 decision before these kinds of things are
Right,
decided on.
absolutely.
Okay. So that can sometimes hold the process up a little bit. If you're in a meeting and it comes upon you to speak, what's your directive? I mean, wait until your board can weigh in on it, or
Well, it depends on what you're doing. Look, you'll develop your guidelines if you decide there's a role for board members in the external world. That should be something you consciously design. And by the way, you might recall, remember we were going ahead to do a big knockdown, drag out day, and we got COVIDed.
yeah.
And so much that's made our world so difficult. But one of the things we were going to brainstorm about, Lisa, is that we were going to brainstorm about the external role of board members. It's not a science. And listen, I am not recommending this to you. You got to, please, you don't have to think that I'm trying to force something on you. What I want you to do is recognize many boards do have heavy engagement in this area. I'm not saying it fits you, but I want you aware that.
To me, it's less about whether we engage with external stakeholders, more about who and how.
Who and how?
Because we have a spokesperson as a board, and that's the board president for now. We can elect it to be somebody different if we choose, but point is, having 7 different messages being sent to external stakeholders, even 2 different contradictory. And right now we're under a microscope because everybody's watching to see if schools will reopen. So any tiny little communication, whether intentional or not, to the public it has implications.
Well, look,
So,
here's what I think your point's very good. Here's what, let me sort of encapsulate this. Here's what I'm seeing. Many boards are deciding this is a function. That's important. Number 1. That there should be some engagement. Number 2, they have a committee responsible, or it's folded into another committee, but it's a function. And what they're doing is just developing what you might call a speakers bureau and finding topics where there's already board agreement or where board agreement would not be necessary because it's just a factual kind of thing. For example, let me tell you about our district. Let me tell you what's happening to our students, our graduates. There's no policy implication to that. It's let me tell you, so you're aware of how important the important contribution we're making. Let me tell you where our students are doing graduate work. What institutions are they getting admitted to? What, I'm sure your track records, would have to be pretty impressive.
Yeah, but I'll be real honest that those are not the topics that come up at the public.
Well, they may not be.
The public are generally critical, and it's up to us to address and respond to.
Well, then you set your rules and maybe you don't go out there. But
No.
you can also have a committee that sets the rules. If I'm asked about an issue where the board is clearly divided, my answer is, the board has not spoken. There's not consensus on that. So let me tell you the two sides that are currently being discussed. That's one guideline of a board I'm working with. That instead of taking a stand yourself, you explain, we're trying to work through this and here are two broad opinions. Do you have any thoughts yourself you'd like to share that I can carry back? See what I'm saying, Lisa? You're governing it. Cynthia?
But even when you're not in the middle of hot controversy, our board always has, and I'm sure will continue to have liaisons to all kinds of work and community organizations, whether it's the Bloomfield Community Coalition, Preservation Bloomfield,
if you choose to, sure. You
know, or the Rotary Club,
right. If you choose to, that would be part of a program of external relations.
And you know, and if you have a legislative committee or you're trying to reach out to legislators, so two things that you may want to try to do. You've got a lot of new folks. The district has had at times in the past, not always, you know, a little piece we called, you know, fingertip facts that you would sort of help provide
Excellent.
board members who are going out in the community a quick set of things they could look at and say, oh, these are good things to be able to get out and talk about. These are things that the community will always be interested to hear about. And you know, as liaisons and serving on some of these external community groups, you know, you're listening, you're learning, and then you're serving as a conduit back to the district for key issues. And if there's something in a way that the district can be involved and have a role in that organization, you're bringing that back to your board and administration to be able to agree to. We are not as individuals committing the district to do anything specific. We're serving as a liaison, and you may be an advocate for something, but you're not committing the district to do something.
Right, and
absolutely, Cynthia, whether you're in business or you're in government, having talking points developed that are consents by the board with the superintendent to be able to give everyone direction in terms of when they go out into the public, what are the policies and the direction of the organization, and you put that together in some talking points, whether it's historical, meaning, you know, facts like Doug was saying, or it's policy recommendations going in the future. We just need to consent on these, and then I don't think we've really done that as much in the past. We might want to do in the future.
I think you may very well want to, and partly because it enriches the role of governing. It enriches the governing experience. It can be fun, but you've got to have, as you pointed out, clear guidelines. And I recommend coaching in the sense of, at least in committee, talking about how we deal with controversial issues. I've found it's relatively easy to avoid committing yourself and still say, we're currently trying to figure out what to do. And we have different viewpoints. Here are a couple of the different viewpoints. And we welcome, your input. We want to hear from you. Anyone want to share anything with me that I can bring back to the board? Well, friends, we got to move. My job, I don't want you to feel cheated. We're going to take a break. I promise that. Jamie, you were going to remind me.
You guys were talking. I didn't want to interrupt. I was just about to tell you.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. No, I reminded myself. We do need, in all fairness to you, to take a break. And what I want to do is, we're now at about 2:30. When we come back from a 10-minute, let's do 10 minutes. Is that all right, Paul? 10 minutes. And when we come back, is that all right with everyone? That's time to do whatever needs to be done, I think. Then we will look at these questions. And these are fun questions that I want you, and we can talk about them, that can help make your governing experience more richer and more rewarding. And frankly, you have a right to a rewarding and even occasionally fun experience. And so these questions relate to that. So I'm taking off my headset and I'm covering the camera, and we are officially for 10 minutes in break. See you in 10. Well, let's see here. Got about a minute left. Is that right, Paul? You can reconvene us when you're ready. I'm not hearing you. Are you muted?
I'm here. I'm
Yeah,
here.
sorry.
Oh,
I
okay.
just wanted to make sure, I can only see a couple on the screen, but, at 2:40, 2:41, just begin. I'm sure people will sign back on.
So you ready?
Yep, just go ahead. Yep. You
Okay.
said 2:40.
Okay. Now, friends, here are 3 questions that I ask in every interview with one-on-one interview with board members before facilitating a retreat of some kind. And they're questions I think you will want to be asking yourself all the time. What do I find most satisfying about this work I'm doing on the board? What do I find least satisfying, or at least less satisfying? What have we actually accomplished as a board? Specifically, what can we point to as notable governing accomplishments of this board? And then, are we facing any issues that we need to address as a board? Now, of course, these 3 questions, which we will definitely be talking about in our 2021 work session, could take up the rest of our time together today. I'm keenly aware of that. They're very open-ended. They're kind of juicy, fairly easy to answer. But I really think you should think about it. And I welcome anybody. We're not doing breakout group work today. It would just be too complex to get through this much material. But would anyone like to share what you found most satisfying and least satisfying about your work?
I think the decision to go ahead and put our bond up for a vote in the middle of COVID could be the most transformative event to happen for our district and have long-term impact for our district for many, many years to come, generations to come. To have been able to pass that bond is a tremendous game changer for our district in all the work that they have ahead of them. It's a very exciting time to be serving the community. I think that's probably, it's one of the most notable accomplishments the board has ever made. A $200 million bond is pretty transformational.
And that is a perfect example of a governing accomplishment, because the board had to play a major role in that. And it's what you would call that the product of a really high impact board. It's not easy to take a step like that. So you can take a lot of pride in that. Any other major accomplishments, governing accomplishments, that you could point to? Well, always be on the lookout for them.
Doug, I would say bringing you on board and having this workshop right now, I think, is a major accomplishment.
And hiring our superintendent.
True.
By the way, hiring a superintendent's a great example. I forget who said it several years ago. I think it was the president of Harvard was asked, what's the most important thing he did as a president of a major prestigious educational institution. He said, when I choose a dean, and of course, when you choose a superintendent, you've done more than just choose a person. You've chosen a philosophy, you've chosen a set of leadership traits, you're going to have impact on the culture. So it's a momentous decision when you choose someone. That's a perfect example.
Was that Larry Bacow?
I'm sorry?
Was that Larry Bacow at
Oh,
Harvard?
at Hart? You know, I don't remember. I
He's
don't
a-
remember.
He's a Bloomfield graduate, I'm just saying.
Really? No, I don't remember. I remember sitting with a group talking about it a few years ago. And we were talking about the fact that one of the most important things a board does is choose someone to head the organization. Probably second to nothing that you do.
That was my top choice, by the way.
Pardon?
That was my number one most significant accomplishment. Satisfying
Now,
governance.
let me ask you this, because I know you're not going to want to talk about, you probably won't want to share what you find least satisfying about your work, and you're welcome to. But number 3, I think, is a safe one. And that is what you think this board is facing as you look ahead in terms of governing issues. Now, by governing issue, I'm not thinking synonymous with strategic issue. I'm thinking having to do with how this board itself works. So you might call them board development kinds of issues, things you think the board needs to pay attention to about its own functioning. So,
Doug, I'd like to try that one. I think there are 2 that we're facing. One is the Michigan Association of School Boards about 3 years ago developed governance standards, which our board looked at about 3 years ago, and we decided to take a pass on it. But that would be something that I'm thinking that we need to consider the early part of next year, as long as we're working with you and looking at changing our governance structure. That would be one thing is a governance issue that we're facing. And the second is, you've heard, I think, that we did a strategic plan a couple of years ago, but we're still having a lot of discussion over really fleshing it out and creating core beliefs, values, moral imperative, really determining what kind of metrics and what kind of measurables and targets we want to set. And we've been talking about it for a couple of years. So I think we really need to nail that down and get that finalized so we can actually start holding ourselves as a board and the administration accountable to meeting the goals that the community set for us a couple of years ago.
those are perfect examples, by the way, of governing issues. Thank you. I mean, they're perfect.
So Howard, those governance standards that MASB put out were contained in the winter of 2017 MASB Leaderboard magazine. And I agree with you that revisiting that is important. And in fact, I suggested to Don Watruba this week that he republish that issue. But I highly recommend it to all of the board, and the whole issue is on school board governance. Actually, there's an article on Doug Eady that's part of that issue, and it's
complimentary, I hope.
It's on governance models, and it is available now on the MASB website and the 2017 Winter Leaderboard magazine.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Any other? Now, I want to point out something just for you to keep in mind. If governing issues sit around but nothing happens, they come up, they go away, they come up, they go away, whatever they might be, but they tend not to lead to action. That is a symptom. Now, I'm not saying that's not my diagnosis. I don't know you that well, but it's not uncommon. It usually is because they have no home. And one of the things we'll be talking about later is the use of a governance, or what you might call board operations committee of the board, as a place where you deal with those kinds of issues. Usually in my business, if an area does not experience movement, it's a structural problem. There's just no home for it. If there's no home for it, there's no real advocacy for it. So individual board members might bring it up and try to talk their colleagues into doing something, but that's notoriously weak as an approach. To try to talk a full board into something is very, very difficult to do. And so these things tend to come up, fade away, come up, fade away. And if you're experiencing any of that, then we want to take a close look at maybe a committee that's explicitly responsible for how the board's organized, how the board does its work, what guidelines there are for how we work together, and so on. And questions like, do we adopt a code or a set of standards? Probably better yet, take that as a starting point and turn it into your own document. Well, once again, our mantra, it's your board. Develop it along the lines you want to develop it. And I think you'll find it leads to more effective governing. Yes.
So Doug, I just wanted to share, we're on the cusp of finishing board operating procedures to govern our own internal actions, I guess, so to speak. There were some communications deficits that we were having. And so that was a priority, is to have a document that explicitly spelled out the circumstances and the means by which communication flows as a team of 8 and with the cabinet. So that will help raise the coherence. And then another similar, but not the same to what Howard said about the strategic plan, I think our big upcoming governance issue is setting very few large district goals, as well as board goals. I think I would like to see that done in January to act as a compass for everything else, the strategic plan and everything that flows down from there.
Good. And we'll be able to get into some of that when we do our session in 21 and take a closer look at that. Well, there is fascinating development going on in the area of strategy. It's basically the putting aside of the traditional what's called comprehensive long-range planning. Take everything you're already doing, project it into the future. Many companies that used to swear by it are abandoning it. Takes tons of paper, tremendous amount of time, and tends to end up on the shelf. Tends to be a fairly unwieldy thing. The world changes, plans are outdated, blah, 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 blah. So there's a lot of work going on now, and it's really, really very fascinating. How do we focus the board on investing in innovation above and beyond what we're doing now? Because the best tool you can use to tweak what you're doing and improve it is budget. You have no other tool equal to budget. When you develop next year's budget, you have a tremendous opportunity to make operational tweaks in how you run the district. You can adjust line items within reason, though remember, most of your budget's pretty fixed. So the board doesn't have a lot of latitude. Very seldom do we get what Mary Ellen Elia, superintendent of the school board here in Tampa Bay, the Tampa School Board, Hillsborough County, she got a $200 million grant from the Gates Foundation to improve teaching. Most organizations don't get windfalls in $200 million chunks. Now, you passed, I take it, in the election, a ballot issue. That gives you something to play with in terms of resources. But where the focus is going is, can we identify as a board candidates for investment in innovation? How do we do that? And they're developing processes for doing that, for identifying candidates for investment. So instead of doing a comprehensive long-range plan for some imaginary period, like 5 years relates to nothing in human affairs. I mean, literally nothing happens in 5-year cycles. That's an invention of planners. They've created an imaginary cycle called the 5-year planning cycle. So how do we engage the board in identifying, working with Pat and his team, where we might find some money to invest in significant innovation?
Just so you know, so I've been doing strategic planning and long-range planning for 30 years, and one of our new school board members, Siva, does that very much as part of his job. So I think we're well acquainted with some of the problems that strategic planning has had in the past, and making sure that we don't repeat those kind of problems.
Good.
But at the same time, you need to have a long-term perspective of setting goals for yourself of where you want to be in the future, because it takes multiple years to implement programs, PD, et cetera. So you do need to look at a planning perspective and timeline. You can't just be looking at month by month or even year by year.
Absolutely. And what you've done, though, is raise this up to a level where it belongs at the board table, where when you're dealing with long-term goals and long-term targets, that's where the board belongs. But that's different from getting into incredible operating detail.
No, and we wouldn't want to do that. But
you
also
wouldn't want to
realize that the timeline for a student is 13 years. So if you're going to make looking at things such as graduation rates, well, that some of those things for the student is set 10, 12 years earlier. So that you need to take a very long-term perspective on any type of academic achievement issues to look at.
And create a framework. But what's fascinating to me is the work being done now. There's a woman at Harvard, Rosabeth Moss Cantor. She's a great speaker, funny. She was at my son's Tulane graduation a few years ago. And she's doing work on how organizations identify investment targets in innovation. In other words, adding new things.
Yeah, let's not go too deep in this rabbit hole. Well, you've got other things to tell us about.
I do, yes. Paul, for Cynthia?
Yeah, I think just going to point 3, one of the things I know as a board, we've just been talking about for a long time I've been on a board is when we define our goals and making sure they're SMART goals, and then deciding as a board, who's defining, those SMART goals within the measurables. That's just something, in terms of the district, strategic plan for the next year or so.
Yeah, good point. Cynthia?
So one of the things I have always found the most satisfying about being a board member is finding opportunities to have innovation that supports the education of our students. And I think that within our bond that we just passed, as we move into a model of having 2 middle schools instead of 3, our educational leaders, our instructional team, are looking at creative opportunities to improve 21st century instruction in a new model that we haven't been experiencing. When we closed 2 elementary schools in the past, it was a painful, divisive process to have to close 2 schools. But we found creative things that we could do in our remaining schools in the process. When we went to 1 high school, it was a difficult process within our community to agree to go to 1 high school instead of 2. But we have a model for years before that. We talked about creating learning communities. That process to move into the new building gave us the chance to implement that in a very effective way. And so I think there are opportunities through change that can really improve our schools in new ways that, we just need to keep looking for those opportunities.
Planning is such a powerful tool for organizational development that I have been very puzzled in my work in the K12 sector by the fact that I seldom encounter an associate superintendent for planning who has the planning portfolio. Do you know there's no other sector where I encounter that I work in? Every major transit system, I do a lot of work in transit. Every major transit system, typically you'll find an assistant CEO in charge of planning. In every economic development corporation I work with, every association like the American Bar Association, I do a lot of association work, you'll find typically a senior executive. It's a very interesting thing. I have no idea why that has developed. It's a question I've chatted a little bit with Pat about, but we might want to think about. Planning is hugely powerful.
Most school districts, we've gone through phases where we have had tremendous public criticism, where if you consider what the public in our community would consider that administrative bloat.
Well, that's too bad. That's the opposite of administrative bloat. But anyway, that's not our topic.
As we go on to slide 33 in your presentation, where you talk about the chief staff liaison, who is going to be that within our, and we'll talk about that in next year. 21. Who is going to be that interface in the staff to the planning committee that you're talking about for the board? And that would be, an interesting discussion that we need to have.
Yeah, and we can talk about it, if not today, but we should have time. Now, the next one I'm going to go through fairly quickly, and we've got some exercises I think you'll enjoy contributing to. Meanwhile, I'm not hearing from a lot of people. I'm not seeing their pictures either. There must be other people who have things to offer, and I hope you will raise questions, including Pat, you and your colleagues here as we're going along. I don't want people to feel you've got to be observers of this meeting. Let's talk now about.
And Doug, just on that point, I think that was one of the things that In the course that me and Howard went over the weekend, that people may have ideas to share, but they just don't feel it's safe, for various reasons. So that's something getting to point 3 that we probably need to work on as a board.
Yeah, and I have an article that appeared in the new magazine issue of School Administrator magazine, which they actually took from a blog post I wrote called Zoom Muzzle Syndrome. If we were together in the same room, physically, it would be much easier for us to generate discussion. It'd also be easier to do some breakout work. Now, we will do breakout work, a lot of it, when we do our day-long meeting. But Zoom actually creates barriers to.
Well, but Doug, but what Paul is talking about, I think, really predates the Zoom world. And you talk about it in a few slides, talking about culture. And we have some culture issues organizationally and within the board that does not promote open conversation. Okay,
well, we're going to get to that, at least the surface aspects of it, because that's a very important issue. And the interesting thing about culture, well, no, let me not get off on that. I have strong opinions as your advisor, your governance advisor, about how to approach shaping a culture for your board. I will tell you this, though, I should be careful saying this, but it's really true. You can't train board members into a better culture. It's something that takes a more hard-nosed approach. And I want to share some ways of doing it. But let's talk about board self-management. Now, this is the accountability piece. This board will perform at the level you want it to perform, but it requires a certain amount of management of that performance. Developing the capacity to manage yourself, though, as a board. I mean, literally, you managing the board as an organization, your organization. Easier said than done, but there's some dividends, some obvious, some not so obvious. Obviously, as we develop our management capacity, we are going to get better at making governing decisions and judgments. So we get a kind of obvious payoff of being more rigorous in how we manage the board. That will lead to greater accountability and commitment without question. But so those two are kind of obvious. It's less obvious, and some of you, I know you're going to roll your eyes now. Don't roll your eyes at me, even if I don't see you, please. And that is that it has a cultural impact on a board. This is an aspect of culture. It does raise board esprit de corps and self-esteem, because the kind of people who serve on our board are high-achieving people. They relate to goals. They relate to monitoring goal achievement. That's how you got here. And so you will find, as you develop the capacity to manage yourself as a governing body, and I didn't say discipline yourself. This is not a tough love thing. I'm talking about just managing your processes. Then you will kindle interest, increased interest in the community to serve on this board. And you will find that it has a cultural impact, a kind of achievement culture. And then you will find, too, that it's a way of building respect for the board and for the governing function around the community. That this is a board that really takes its own performance seriously, that evaluates itself, and is not afraid to be transparent in doing that. So there's some.
And Doug, I would even add greater public respect for the board and board members.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I see that
between board members is some of that culture issue we were talking about.
Yep. And so what seems, there's more here than meets the eye. I don't want you to think about board self-management as a disciplinary tool. Oh, there's a little bit of that, but it's mainly us together deciding how we want to measure our performance. Otherwise, it's difficult to do board development. And the default, of course, is a training program of some kind. But I'm talking about something that you yourselves manage. Now, here's something I've learned. If you want an accountable board that plays a strong role in running its own operation, governing operation, you have virtually got to have a committee. Otherwise, it doesn't have a home. There's nowhere to talk about it. So it pops up in board meetings every so often. Oh, we should have some performance targets. We have a little discussion. It fades away. Then a year later, it comes up, blah, blah, blah. And the way you prevent that is to have a committee consciously responsible for board self-management. And there are two aspects to that. It usually, by the way, is headed by the board president, in fact, always is, and consists typically of standing committee chairs. So if you've got two standing committees and the board president, you've got 3 people on this committee. That's typically how it's done, but it's your board, you'll decide. But basically, it's a committee on board operations, which I don't think you have now in any form. Now, what is board self-management? Well, there are 2 aspects to it, and they're things you can literally do very concretely. No high tech, no big investment. Number 1, we can develop the people. And in the process of developing the people, develop the culture. We develop the composition of the board. We can do that with orientation for new board members, all kinds of ways. And we can manage the board's governing performance. We can set targets and we can monitor. We can do self-evaluation. Now, where people are concerned, and I know you have a highly qualified board. I'm well aware of that. But we can always strengthen knowledge and skills if we want to. And the simplest way is, welcome to the board. Here's your orientation. It's detailed, it's well crafted, it's delivered often, by the way, by the governance committee of the board. And the best orientations heavily focus on the board itself. I've noticed a tendency around the country for orientation programs to focus more on things like district finances, educational programs, the buildings, and very little, only a smidgen of the board's role, the board's responsibilities, the board's function, when in reality, when you bring board members on, you're not bringing them on to manage educational operations of the district. We've got a superintendent. You're bringing them on to govern the district. So governance should be the focus of our orientation. But many orientation programs spend more time talking about every other thing, but not the board. The second thing you can do is to have a formal program. I don't know if you have one. You probably do. I know you're an outstanding board, but a formal program with a budget for ongoing education and training. This is where it helps to have a governance committee. Who do you send to what conferences? I I'm going to be speaking at NSBA. Unfortunately, it'll be virtual, I think, but I just got a note that I'd be doing a session there, and I'm hoping to see some of you. And when we actually get over COVID and we can meet together and have a great national conference, one of the issues in a program for board development is how do you decide who goes to what conference? And when they go, do they report back? How do we rotate people from conference to conference? How much money do we set aside for these kinds of things? And so on and so forth. Do we have a library, lending library of governance books and publications? Do we have mentoring? All kinds of things that aren't terribly expensive. Now, I realize travel to conferences is one of the bigger ticket items here, but there are a lot of things you can do. And then you can also pay close attention to guidelines for communicating and interacting with each other. Not only what communication protocols should be, but how we should treat each other in interaction. What standards do we want to set for how we engage in dialogue and work our way through issues? Now, on the managing board performance side, got a couple of simple things to do if we got a committee. Number one, let's agree what we're basically holding ourselves accountable for. Let's be very concrete, not general. For example, and we can hold ourselves accountable for particular governing targets, and we can hold ourselves accountable for non-governing targets that we think make sense for board members to be accountable for. Well, that was a terrible sentence. Sorry, any former English teachers here. So, for example, I give an example here of attending graduation ceremonies. Many school boards will actually assign board members to attend certain graduation exercises. Well, that's not governing by definition. It's a different role. It's a non-governing role of a board member. We want them to be seen. We want to signal that education is very important, that they care, and so we want them visible. That's non-governing work. External relations is non-governing work. If you go speak, you're not governing, you're speaking. You all with me there? So when you think about performance targets you want to set yourself and you want to be monitored for, you think of two sets. And performance might just be attendance plus 3 or 4 other things that you want it clearly understood that you're accountable for. You attend committee meetings, you attend board meetings. We're going to monitor that. We might specify that if we have a strategic planning retreat, that's by definition a big ticket item that we would expect all board members to attend, and so on and so forth. And also assess how we're performing as a governing body against standards we've set. Now, cautionary note, friends. Self-assessment questionnaires filled out in the privacy of one's office tend to be virtually worthless. Waste of time. Don't do it. Don't call that serious self-assessment. They're too subjective. They're too, they tend, if you're not careful, to be self-congratulatory, but definitely totally subjective. those would be questions like, how well are board meetings run? Those open-ended sort of assessments. They're 100% just, in my eyes, in my opinion, they aren't measurable.
Doug,
So,
one of the things that MASB offers is a board self-assessment questionnaire that you can fill out. Now, those questions, though, are based upon the MASB governance standards that were done, that are benchmarked. So what they're doing is it's a feedback loop to say, here are the governance standards, and here's the questionnaire you should fill out annually to self-assess how you're doing against those standards.
now, here's what I would recommend to you. That sounds good to me. I would recommend, and this is what I'm seeing, a committee responsible for board performance that is responsible for monitoring and assessment, that every year has a substantive discussion, a mini retreat, if you will, not a questionnaire. Where do we see that we're falling short as a board, where we need to beef up our performance this coming year?
I think you can do both. The questionnaire is a
Oh,
starting
yes.
point, but then you have a session where you take the data that you've accumulated from the questionnaire and you talk about it, and you use it to then set your next year's board goals.
Then you're doing it. Great. But make sure you have a body accountable.
Yep.
What you've got to be very careful about is don't have questionnaires filled out in the privacy of offices, then tabulated. Then you've got a report, but you have nothing. It doesn't feed into a process. The only reason for doing assessment is board development. Next year's board gets better at doing certain things than this year's board. It's the only reason for doing it. That won't happen unless, I promise you, unless you've got a responsible committee and they're actually developing a plan for next year's governance improvements, whatever they are. So this is not an earth-shaking area, but it's well worth some time. It's very simple for you to manage. Now, here are some questions that I want you to think about and we can talk about. Number one, what is an effective orientation for new board members so you can make sure that it's delivered? What would be at the top of your list? Welcome to the board. What do you need to tell a new board member? Yeah.
I mean, I think I would just start with telling them like what I wish I had known at the beginning, but think I know now, but maybe I'm not at all sure.
Yeah. Well, that's a creative answer.
What the growing process has been for myself, right? So hopefully that we can benefit from that experience.
Well, that's a good answer. And you know, this may seem a little elementary, but I've seen, and I've never seen your orientation process, so I'm not, believe me, I'm not critiquing it. But I have seen orientations that don't even explain the board structure and decision-making process as a preeminent piece.
To your earlier point, Doug, I think your point about orientation, about governance being the focal point is really key. I think my orientation a couple years ago was operations, right? So it just, maybe you start out with like a different lens or a different set of assumptions about what you're supposed to know or what you're supposed to be doing. So yeah.
And you know, once we go through this process, we're going to do some tweaking, of course, as a result of what we do in phase 2. Once we have formally adopted a set of board performance targets, standards for communicating with each other, we've tweaked the structure of the board, and we've strengthened it, modernized it, if you will. The committees are we consciously redesign our committee structure. Then next year's orientation, welcome to the board. We're delighted to see you. By the way, here's your committee assignment for the coming year. You'll see the committee structure. Here are the functions of our committees. You should be aware of the committees because we have a standard of rotating people from committee to committee over time. So you'll want to know what's coming up for you and so on. And then you get into, here's our governing mission, job description for the board. Many of my clients are developing one-page descriptions of what you're accountable for as a board member. It raises the board to a more serious level. And they get all this stuff. Then you can turn your attention to, now we want to tell you how we manage. Want to tell you about our educational programs, how we develop curriculum in the district. And that's where you turn the baton to the superintendent.
I
But you yeah.
Sorry, I think going back to what Cynthia said at the beginning, which I absolutely think has been the case when I joined anyway, the first thing I would start with is asking them what they hope to accomplish and why they ran, and then work from there and figure out how to fill in the information they need so that they can achieve their personal objectives and work within the parameters of the school district and, you know, some restrictions of the board to help them get there. Because these are 3 people who spend an awful lot of time and expense in campaigning and running for something, and I don't have any sense of why. And like Cynthia said, maybe more so, she certainly would know, but she says it's, you know, it's 27 different board members, and I certainly believe that. People don't just come on because they want to help. There's usually something else. So it would be worth it, I think, to figure out what that is, because it's going to be different for every single person. And I don't think it's necessarily a waste of time, but to focus on areas that aren't in there, that they don't necessarily need to know and aren't within their area of interest or why that they decided to be there, would maybe come later if necessary, but certainly wouldn't be where I'd start.
I think that'd be an excellent exercise at a team building kind of retreat. And even when we do something in 2021, we can probably build in. I like the sound of that. But here, one thing you're going to have though, is the formal documents that describe the board as part of your orientation. You're going to have, if you got a job description for the board, I don't know how up to date yours is. I haven't seen it, but if you got a job description for the board, we want to see it.
We don't have one.
If you have bylaws, which I think you do, you'll want to make them available. You've got a committee structure. New board members have to understand the structure they're feeding into. If you're monitoring performance, you have to share the targets we're actually monitoring with new people so that they hit the ground running as opposed to having to try to figure out. And then I think the idea of getting acquainted with each other in terms of, well, why did you decide to come on the board? What are your special interests and so on? That's very important too. Now, we talked about ongoing. That's orientation. Bottom line, it's a committee responsibility. Can't be delegated to the superintendent. Superintendent's part of it. But board members have to play a strong role in orienting board members. And that's my professional opinion, that it's your responsibility to develop the capability of the people on the board. Number two, you need some kind of formal program or it'll be catch as catch can. Without a committee, you won't get a program for ongoing board development. It just won't happen. There's no accountability for making it happen, so it won't happen. So simplest thing in the world, your governance committee every year updates its plan for the coming year and how we're going to keep board members up to date in the governing area and what's going on in governing.
Doug,
And
for our organization, board development, board PD is really at the discretion of the individual board member. There is no overarching expectation from the board as an organization for that.
Is that the way you want it?
That's something we can talk about.
Yeah, you should talk about it. It's one of the keys to taking a board to the next level, is systematically developing knowledge and skills in a rapidly changing field. You've got to be careful with, this is why training is a tool you've got to look at very carefully, because it's easy to get wedded to yesterday's way of doing things if you're not careful. And so you want your board members to be up to date on what's happening. What is the newest thinking about board structure? What's the newest thinking about board participation and strategic decision making? What is the latest experience we have? And that's typically requires pretty careful monitoring of what's going on. Performance targets we've already talked about. There can't be many. Attend, remain conscious through meetings. Come prepared. They can be monitored, if not precisely measured. There can't be too many of them, or they'll collapse of their own weight. But just make sure you do have something you can hand to new board members that tells them what they're generally responsible for doing.
We
Now,
actually have a document that for many years that was an annual statement of roles and responsibilities that our board members annually would sign at the organizational meeting at the beginning of each year, sort of recommitting ourselves to those principles of how we conduct ourselves.
have you every year updated performance targets for the board and board members?
Some of that, and I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but some of that are the ethics.
That's part of it.
Which is also important, but that's different than performance guidelines.
Well, it is, but it falls in the same general category of guidelines for how the board functions.
Sure, sure.
So yeah, I would include that. By the way, ethics would be on an orientation program for sure, and make sure people understand who are joining the board. What do we define as a conflict of interest? What could you do to get you into trouble, get yourself into trouble on this board? And make sure everyone understands that. Now, communication is a related area, but very important, and how we interact with each other. standards for interacting with each other should be part of board self-management. For example, what do you currently have as standards? Give me some examples of current written formal standards for governing your interactions with each other.
So are you talking about like norms?
Yeah, norms, sure.
I don't know whether we have any. Cynthia, do you know whether we have any board norms?
So again, that statement that I was referring to, that we would sign each year on roles and responsibility of the board, was really sort of the basis for how we work together.
Well, then maybe, now I never recommend resurrecting a document like that per se and just editing it, because that's too limiting. But what you could do is have your governance committee, well, if you had one, look at extant documentation, but also do brainstorming of its own, or we incorporate it in a retreat.
We also have to be really cognizant of the Open Meetings Act. So the way that we communicate is to a large extent, well, you know, Doug, it's dictated by Michigan statute. So communicating with 7 board members at once is not much of a dialogue. We cannot have a back and forth if we're not in an open meeting.
Sure, but Lisa, what he's talking about is, I think, less the process of actually communicating, whether email or verbal or things like that, but it's more of how do we treat each other?
How do you treat each other?
Also, we work within the parameters. I, for one, don't like having group discussions one-on-one because there is much lost in translation, but we're forced sometimes to do that when communicating outside of an open meeting. So I think it adds another layer to obviously the how we treat each other with respect, with you know, with certain adult human learned, hopefully we've all by now learned behaviors of how to respect and treat each other. But I like to be able to be transparent with people that I speak to, and sometimes it's not possible given the parameters of the system that we were confined to. So, you know.
I think what Doug is referring to is, I know we've all been, and Doug doesn't know this person, but we've been with sessions with Jay Marks. And Jay Marks is very, very religious about making sure that the first thing you do when you ever have a group together is develop some norms, develop how you communicate with one another and how you're respectful and listen and things like that. It's less about the OMA structural things, but it's more as how we treat ourselves as human beings.
Well, I have to tell you, I've facilitated and sat through hundreds of board sessions. By definition, they have to be public, which is neither here nor there. That's no problem. Where they've talked about the norms, and no reason why that should be behind the scenes. Here are the standards that we choose to set for communicating with each other and for interacting with each other. Mm-hmm. And the law never defines that.
Maybe I am misinterpreting it. I guess I'm working under the assumption, maybe wrong, that we all treat each other with respect and decency.
I don't know. I don't know you that well, but
okay. Has not been our experience so far. Lisa, that hasn't been our experience over the last few years, unfortunately.
Oh, well, I would say the opposite, Howard. I feel as if personally I've been treated respectfully and that I would do the same to others. Now, we disagree on fundamental issues sometimes. That's totally acceptable. But I haven't heard any name calling. I haven't heard any disrespectful.
But here's the point. That's something the group decides.
Correct.
How it's going to do. It's something that you should have a committee accountable for. Bring and do whatever brainstorming input you need. But this is something that I'm seeing boards do all over the country with no problem at all. You should set guidelines for how you interact. You should have norms for how you treat each other. And so that when you bring people on, new people are elected to the board. It's something you can orient them to.
And these norms would not only be how we treat each other, the 7, but how we treat the superintendent and also how we interact with the cabinet. It's the whole governance
absolutely.
process.
Absolutely. And by the way, we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but that's a key part of this. Says what communication channels do we want between the board and individual board members and the superintendent, but also the superintendent's cabinet. The point is, my friends, none of this should be left vague. There is no virtue in leaving it vague. That's when we run into problems, is when we don't have clear expectations. So this is a kind of undramatic little vignette. I'm sorry, it's not very exciting. Very simple, not rocket science. Have a committee responsible for board operations. Develop clear communication guidelines, interaction guidelines. That includes norms for how you treat each other. Be very explicit about what board members are being held accountable for in terms of governing performance. Probably going to be fairly simple. You've taken care of a lot of it by just talking about attendance and preparation, but you can also get into meatier issues. Now, we've got, according to my, let's see here, I want to take a quick check. We got about 20 minutes, right? Is that correct? You all agree?
Yep.
Okay, let's then turn to the final pieces. I'll move a little bit faster. By the way, I want to compliment you. I think the discussion, the points you've offered have been very, very good points, very pertinent. I am really looking forward to spending a day together. And I hope that, and this is my bottom line expectation for today. It's not a training session, obviously. I didn't plan it to be. It's a get you thinking about your business, which is governing. Thinking maybe a little more specifically about it, a little more, think a bit more about the possibilities for getting better at governing. That's all. That's my expectation for today. You are doing the most complex and high-level work possible when you govern an organization. It is second to none. To do it well is a huge challenge. And ironically, you should understand this subject has gotten the least attention in graduate schools of education. In fact, my polling at conferences every year when I speak at NSBA National and I speak at AASA, when they actually have conferences, but in prior years I polled the group. I always say, who's had a really good course in working with the board? I ask superintendents in graduate school. I will tell you, I never get more than 1 or 2 hands in a group of 300 people. It has not been considered a top tier subject.
And you're saying that's 25 to 30% of their work.
It absolutely is. If they don't want to be fired, if you want to have a long, happy tenure with the board, you better know something about boards. This is what I say to superintendents. And frankly, I have not a clue why this has happened. But anyway, part of the fun of doing what we're doing together is you do understand we're not only beefing up our own design as a board, our structure, our processes, how we work together, but also, in a sense, we are building what I call a teaching board. That I'd love, I don't know how much speaking you've done as a district at NSBA and AASA. I've been doing some chatting with Pat, but I would love to join you sometime at a national NSBA meeting and talk about what you're accomplishing in terms of board development, taking the message out there to the wider world. Well, let's look now quickly at two additional subjects. That is board structure and the board superintendent relationship. And so let's take a look at boards, at board committees. Now, you've got committees, but I think we have some reason to believe we can do some updating and tweaking to make them more effective tools for you. And it's pretty well worth doing because committees can have a tremendous amount of impact. I actually decided a few years ago that I put committees in the top 3 determinants of board performance. And so to me, they're well worth a look. They definitely actively engage board members. They are a form of empowerment. They create a lot of expertise in governing because you get into the details. And if you rotate board members among committees, which I strongly recommend, everyone then over time, if you're around long enough, will get exposure to different aspects of governance. So no one owns something. You don't want a board where you say, well, they're the financial people on the board, they're the legal people on the board. That sort of quilt approach does not lead to strong board leadership. I want everyone to be well informed and knowledgeable about every aspect of governance. They do boost productivity without question because board meetings get better organized and more productive, and they make better use of time. But also they give you a home to think about board engagement, and that's not so obvious. I want to talk about that with you. I'm going to be really quick here because I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about this question in the recent past. But remember that the keys to effective committees are that they correspond to those broad governing streams we talked about. Otherwise, they're out of sync. There's a great classic rule in American leadership and management. It was developed in this country, in the corporate world, and that is form must follow function. So form means structure, and your committee structure should relate to the work of governing, not the work of managing. So we want to get away from the old time silo structures of the past, which, and I have no clue about where they ever came from. They've caused a lot of harm, where we get board members engaged in what are essentially administrative silos. It invites micromanagement, but perhaps more importantly, it lowers the board's performance as a governing body. So we want to stay away from administrative functions where the board's concerned. We need to have standing committees, otherwise you have no coherence at all. I want to tell you that you will go crazy using ad hoc committees with the board. It's the worst possible approach you can take in using precious board time. They can be virtual with a real small board. you have no need to go with virtual committees. I do have clients going the virtual route. I'll explain what I mean in a minute, but you can have fully functioning committees with your current board membership. Now, so here are the streams. Remember we talked about this earlier? Remember we said judgments and decisions that flow along these streams? Here they are. You make decisions and judgments about planning. You make them about performance, about plans, I should say, and the parts of plans, monitoring and maintaining relations with the community. Every one of these streams cuts across all the normal administrative silos. That's the key to board influence, is you rise above the silos. We have a superintendent to manage the silos. We don't need the board to get engaged. Silos are the basic administrative functions. You've got human resource development, you've got finance, you've got developing curriculum, which doesn't have an ounce of governing content in it. It's a reflection of decisions you make as a board, but it's not a governing function to develop a detailed curriculum. And so we now are empowering the board by having each committee cut across everything going on in the district. So we're planning for everything. Now we're not doing all the planning, but we are engaged in the planning process. That's the key to effective committees. You've seen a chart that looks something like this. With a board of your size, it's possible you wouldn't want 3 bread and butter committees. If you had 9 board members, you might want to fold external stakeholder relations into planning. We don't need to decide that now. But you got to be careful you don't chop board members' time into 2 small bits, and that you have 2 committees that are too small. And your board comes dangerously close to that because you're a fairly small board. By the way, small boards are not an asset. It's one of the key big problems in K12 as a sector is, and I can't even tell you the history, but school boards tend, except in some of the largest cities, to be too small. It limits diversity, it limits the range of knowledge and expertise. I don't know where it came from, but it's basically enshrined in legislation. So we're not about to change it, nor am I going to tackle it. But we do want critical mass. Yeah.
So hearing what you're saying about 7 people and not overextending and maybe phasing in an external relations functions like into one of the 2 other committees once we get our bearings. Along those lines, like as I try to think about this, and it's a big change that we want to make here. Do you recommend staggering it? Because like, I'm thinking, what's the accountability committee going to do until the planning committee plans something, right?
No,
like, should those 2 committees happen at once, or should this really start with a planning committee and then the accountability committee is phased in?
I would not, I never view it that way.
Okay.
Okay. You start at a point in time.
Okay.
Your planning committee, just by the very nature of planning, is putting together, is overseeing, not doing the planning, but overseeing the process of developing plans for next year and beyond. So any given year, you've got a committee looking forward to the following year. And it has its own cycle of how it does that work. That same year, there's a monitoring committee monitoring the plan that's already in place. The connector is always staff. among the committees. And the committee process is typically supported by and generally managed by the superintendent and his cabinet. So they keep everything straight. But assume there's a starting point. Any given year, you're going to want your monitoring committee to be monitoring using whatever reports you currently have, and also thinking about ways of tweaking the reports in terms of content and format the next year.
So like budget would be a good example, because as you've said a couple times, that's obviously established, always,
right.
always there, always in motion.
Right.
And that is something that the accountability committee could start with right away.
It always starts with something.
Yeah.
But that committee is also going to be thinking about ways it can do a better job of monitoring with support from Pat and his team.
Mm-hmm.
Now listen, undergirding all of this is a philosophy. It is extraordinarily important. Pat and I have had a lot of conversations, and I know he subscribes to this. And that is, the superintendent is responsible for helping the board to realize more fully its governing potential. By working closely with its committees to help it figure out how to do a better job of monitoring, to help it figure out how to do a better job of planning for the future. Undergirding this whole thing we're doing together is a partnership. A superintendent who believes in a strong board and who has no interest in limiting that board. Obviously, we have functional guidelines and so on and so forth. And obviously, you wouldn't want to start managing a building, or you wouldn't want board members floating around different buildings unannounced and stuff like that. That's a matter of developing standards. But basically, you want your superintendent and your executive team, or cabinet as we call it, to be very attuned to helping you be the board you're capable of being. You don't have any problem with composition. You know that, I know that. But we are challenged by somewhat outmoded structure and process. And that's where Pat is responsible for helping you. In fact, if composition were the only issue, we wouldn't be having a meeting. You've got an outstanding board. So, governance, I've already talked about. Just keep in mind, governance is a key piece of the architecture, the structure of the board, because this is where you consciously pay attention to the board itself. You say the board's an organization, it's our organization, we should consciously manage it. Pat and his team can't manage it, they can support it. We are responsible for determining how we behave as board members, what our job description is, and so on. Now, there's some things we can do. I just want to throw them out. We're actually going to run out of time here, and I don't want to. It has been said that the least loved facilitators in the world leave slides unpresented or go over the time. So I have to speed up here quickly, but the rest of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory. You have the slides, by the way. But there are some tricks of the trade for making sure committees are truly influential. One of them is to make sure you assign every board member to a committee. Typically, the board president does that. And when new board members come on, they get an assignment. That you only have one committee assignment. More than that, we're sort of in la la land, because you're very busy people And even if you might be retired from your primary profession, you're still very busy people. It's the nature of who you are. And so there's a limit to what we can expect. We've got to make sure that these are not discussion groups. That committees are the only way you reach the board agenda for the regular board meeting. That, if you will, is a calcium injection. Without that, and I've never seen a problem with that, ever, with any client in 30 years. You get to the board meeting through a committee. Otherwise, they'll become just discussion groups. And people will stop attending. Why should I attend? All we do is talk. Third, make sure you rotate committee chairs and members. So if you stick around for a while, you got a damn good chance of chairing at least one committee, maybe two, maybe three. If you're long tenured, you should chair every committee, maybe more than once. Otherwise, you won't get the full range of experience. And remember, no one's just throwing you into a committee to chair. Pat and his team are responsible for making sure you succeed and promising you will succeed in chairing that committee. You'll get all the support you need. And then we assign a cabinet member to be the administrative support to that committee. It's a very powerful piece of this. If we do move ahead together to a phase 2, and if I am so privileged as to be a consultant to you in phase 2, what I would typically do when we've restructured and we've got new committees going is I spend a whole day with the superintendent and the cabinet strategizing how to make sure those committees hit the ground running, how to make sure they're superbly staffed so that they function at a high level. We never want a board member thinking, why am I sitting through this? Why am I sitting here through this discussion? So we want to make sure they're powerful. Now, I would like to share a couple of variations I've already talked
Doug,
about.
can I ask you a quick question?
Of course.
Your point about how you don't ever want committee meetings to become discussion groups, and what I've noticed about the work of education is that it's so complicated, it's so nuanced. There is so much to discuss, right? Like so that I feel like that does happen. Is it reasonable to say at the beginning of each of these meetings, like this is sort of how it works in my day job, that you know you're going to come out of this meeting with a short list of action items? Like,
Oh, absolutely.
You don't, like, the meeting is not over until the action items are established. That's a fair way to structure this?
Yeah, you try to make sure there are action items. Now, it's not always the case there will be, because it's not the nature of the business that it generates a steady stream every committee meeting. But yeah, what you basically want is a pretty rigorously managed process. And look, friends, there's no problem with work sessions for open discussion of complex issues. You want to build into the process that any one of your committees can identify a time when you might need to pull the whole board together for a discussion. It's a responsibility of a committee to determine that. And a classic we've already talked about, you develop a budget every year. And we want our planning committee to host budget planning sessions involving all board members. And we would like to have some really good, exciting discussion early on. So we don't want to eliminate that idea. It is a complex business, but we've got to manage that discussion. So it's very, very focused. I'm a great believer in an annual strategic planning session with the board. Very well planned. And so there's we have opportunity we build in for open discussion. Now, you don't have a board of 5 members, thank heaven. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be talking about committees. I do think, however, if you did, I'd probably go what I call the virtual committee route, which is you use a committee of the whole session and you divide it into committee segments. I have a client doing that right now. I've had several clients, including the school board in Reno, Nevada, a few years ago. And their issue was they just didn't trust each other. And so they weren't about to start full-fledged committees meeting separately. There wasn't enough trust. So I said, fine, I mean, then meet once a month as a committee of the whole board and divide it into 3 committee segments. And each committee has a different board member chairing it, but it's the same cast of characters. With the small board, you can do that. You still get a lot of benefits of the committees when you do that, because you're dividing the work into these different segments. So it's better organized. Each segment has an executive responsible for working with it, has a different board member chairing it. So you get a lot of the benefits. A 7-member board, you could have, as I said, you might fold external relations into one of the other 2 as a beginner, just to make sure you're not stretching board members too.
Doug, let me ask you, with Michigan, and I'm sure a lot of other states, we have the Open Meetings Act, which
Right.
With 3 or less, you have a minority of the board, so therefore you can have it closed.
But you wouldn't want
open to the public. What is your recommendation?
Always be open. Always be open. You gain nothing from closed meetings, nothing, except in those areas specified as justifying closed meetings. So take the rule as the rule that would apply to a full board meeting as the rule for your committee meetings, that you post committee meetings and the public is welcome. That's what my clients do.
One of the shortcomings we found out working with our lawyers a few years ago on this very issue was that if you post it as an open meeting of the whole board and only 3 members of the board attend because that's the committee, then 4 board members are shown as absent. And it might—
No, you don't post it as, no, you don't post it as a full board member. You just post the fact that here's your committee schedule for the month. And the public's always invited to observe committee meetings. And when it's justified to go into executive session, you do. And that's it.
Okay, thank you.
It's not a full board meeting. You're not convening a board meeting.
So Doug, that's a slippery slope that we've already spent many hours discussing, and I think we're out of time for the day. I think you ought to, but I do think the board will need to address that more fully because there are a lot of other concerns with that. I guess what I want to make a comment, because I know we are definitely out of time, we're past time. I hope that as you continue to work with Doug, that you can infuse a little more language that is about supporting students and student achievement, because I think that's why most people ran for the board. They want to support our students. And I don't know, I understand, Doug, you don't see that as part of a governance conversation, but you know, as part of Michigan Association of School Boards and the National School Board Association, we are encouraged to make sure that we are infusing student achievement and why we are doing the business things that we are doing in support of our students. And I hope that as you move forward, because I'm not going to be on the board as we move forward, that this conversation can be a little bit more infused with the governance of public schools, because we are not a different kind of a nonprofit. We are a school district.
Well,
yeah, you're absolutely correct. And that's based on how we set our goals. If we set the vast majority of our goals related to student achievement, that's what we're going to focus on, is student achievement.
Which is why it's not been a major focus of the discussion, because
Along the lines
your
of
job
what
is
Cynthia's
student
saying, too.
achievement.
I
So-
Along the lines of what Cynthia's saying, there is, to me, no separating our progress as a board in a silo without looking at it in the exact same light as student achievement. If our students aren't achieving, then we're not achieving.
Of course.
We're a high
And-
functioning board.
Absolutely.
But I think that we all think that, but I think we can't reiterate it enough that there is no other. There's no close second standard of being an achieving board if it's not always 100% tied to student achievement.
Absolutely.
Let me sort of close that loop. I didn't discuss it because it didn't fit what we're discussing today. It's a
Hey,
given.
Doug, I'm just conscious it's 4:10. I don't know what people have in their day.
Okay,
so,
shall we wind up and let me just make a quick closing statement.
No, that's fine.
The way you impact student achievement is through the things we've been talking about. Through a planning process that develops high quality plans. Obviously, student achievement is the content, a large part of the content. Through a committee that is designed to monitor student achievement. Otherwise, you have no idea of how well you're performing. Everything we've talked about relates to student achievement, almost to the point it seemed to me to go without saying, because it's the content of your plans. It's the content you'll be monitoring. So we are talking directly about strengthening student achievement through this process. But our vantage point is the board exerting influence on that issue. That's the whole thing about governance improvement. Listen, there are a couple of other things we didn't talk about, but they're self-explanatory. You've got the slides. We'll have time in early in the new year. The board will have at least a full day session. We have got much of the agenda developed. I'm looking forward to seeing you. It probably will be virtual again, sad to say, but maybe somewhere down the pike we'll be together and I can finally meet you and see your beautiful community. So thanks much for joining me on this little journey around the governance terrain, and I wish you a great evening and happy holidays.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks to everyone for taking the time out of their Friday. Everyone have a great weekend, and we'll probably see each other on the 17th.
Okay. All right.
Take care, everyone. We're closing the meeting down now. It's been recorded, and the recording will be available. Anyone who missed this session will have it. And of course, some of you may want to watch it too, and that'll be in the hands of the ever always capable Rebecca. So as soon as we have it, I will pass it to her.
Happy holidays, Doug.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Take care.
Doug.